Hello, I'm Arian Dale with Over the Horizon Journal. With me today is the former Air Force Space Command Commander, General William Shelton. General Shelton, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, glad to be here. Thank you.
Sir, you know the military is heavily reliant on space, the space domain, for our activities that we conduct throughout the world. If we were attacked in space, how would that impact our capability to carry out operations?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the attack, of course, but I would totally agree with you that we're very dependent on space. In fact, the words I like to use is that it is foundational to every military operation. There is nothing I found anyway that's militarily significant that we do that doesn't somehow depend on space. So it's up to us really to defend our space capability, and should somebody decide that they are going to attack our space capability, the way we're postured right now, an attack on, let's say, an advanced communications satellite that the president depends on, frankly, to get the nuclear orders out there, that would open up a significant geographical hole in our constellation and make it very difficult for him to get those nuclear orders out there. So we now have a situation where we've got what used to be an ethereal, pristine environment has now become an environment that's threatening, potentially threatening anyway. And we need to respond in kind. You can't imagine that in another domain, land, sea, or air, cyber for that matter, that if we knew there was a threat there, we wouldn't take some sort of defensive action. And yet that's where we find ourselves today, is we really haven't postured to adequately defend our satellites. And the impact would be significant. If you talk about a missile warning capability, same kind of thing. You take out a missile warning satellite and you've taken out a geographical coverage in our constellation that opens up a hole that somebody could exploit. So communications, navigation, missile warning, precise timing that's coming from GPS, all those things we need to think very hard about defending, because it is so significant and so foundational to what we do in military operations today.
Yes, sir. And developing those defenses, or the way that we're postured now and the way we need to improve, what we've seen recently, at least in the civilian sector, is there's been these huge improvements, or these leaps and bounds of how they are able to move forward with the civilian sector. Thinking about how the military and the defense sector needs to potentially reposture to be better in the future, thinking just maybe down the 5 to 10 year road mark, is what do we need to do? What do we need to do to be better postured? And is there anything the civilian sector can do to help us with that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think a lot of people see some of the advances in the civilian sector, and therefore they think that the military should swing that direction. But let's think about the kinds of missions that are being done in the civilian sector versus what we do in the national security sector. The civilian sector is not doing precise navigation and timing. The civilian sector is not doing IR sensors on orbit to provide very precise missile warning. The civilian sector is not doing extremely high frequency satellite communications that is jam resistant and absolutely essential for survival of the United States and on its worst day. So yes, they are doing some significant things in terms of communications, in terms of at some point placing broadband capability in low Earth orbit, and those sorts of things. We can certainly take advantage of those technologies in terms of the way they're producing those satellites, the volume that's being produced. If we end up seeing thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit constellations to provide 24/7 coverage for broadband, for example, that production model that will produce that number of satellites in short order is certainly something that we can take advantage of. And who knows, maybe just the platform itself, not the payload, not the electronics that provide the broadband communication capability, but that particular satellite, what we call a satellite bus. We might be able to use those for other payloads that are militarily significant. So there's a lot we can learn. There's a lot we can learn in the launch business from the civilian sector, the commercial sector. We're seeing what I call the billionaires club, go after the launch business. And SpaceX alone has produced some really good approaches to launch and brought the efficiencies up and the prices down such that it's put a lot of pressure on the national security provider, United Launch Alliance, to bring their prices down and to become more efficient. So that's good in and of itself. SpaceX is now certified to compete for national security launches. We will see them increasingly providing that capability for us in the future. Again, much more economical for us. And as the launch price goes down, our ability to be much more flexible about what we put in orbit opens up. So a lot to be learned, but it's not a wholesale one-for-one either.
Sure. Okay. Next question deals with our adversary. And some would say that the technology gap between us and our adversaries has either been reduced or some of our adversaries maybe have surpassed us. Kind of like to know what your thoughts are on that gap, and if we need to increase it, what do we do to increase that technology gap between us and our adversaries to make sure that our space capabilities stay a step ahead of our adversaries?
Yeah, it's really troubling a bit to see those kinds of concerns, those kind of, if you will, accusations that somehow we're falling behind in a technology sense, because I don't believe that's true. What adversaries have done is certainly significant. I don't want to underplay at all what particularly the Chinese and the Russians have done. But at the same time, had the United States had the will and desire to do those same things, we could have done those things. So, 2007, the Chinese shoot one of their own satellites out of the sky with an ASAT weapon. Not long after that, we shot down our own satellite because not for the same reason the Chinese did, but we were concerned that a satellite that had failed roughly 24 hours before, or 24 hours just after it launched, had a full load of fuel on board. Had that satellite re-entered with all that fuel on board, it was clearly a threat to human life. And even though the world's 70% water, you couldn't take the 30% chance that it was going to hit land somewhere. So we elected to shoot it down. So we've proven that we can do that sort of thing. It's just been a matter of will and the budget to be able to do it. Now that the Chinese and the Russians have passed that Rubicon, if you will, of capability that is threatening to us, there is no question that we need to address it, and we need to address it right now.
Yes, sir. You did mention the will and the resourcing. That also plays heavily into the acquisitions arena. General Hyten, the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, as well as General Raymond, the current commander of Air Force Space Command, have both talked about how the acquisition process needs to move faster. This kind of goes along the lines of some previous thoughts or current thoughts that you have about controlling space costs. Could you first talk a little bit about that, and then could you also mention or talk about if we needed to reconstitute space assets now, or do we have that capability? Could we meet a timeline, and what does that timeline kind of look like?
Yeah. There is no question that the acquisition system is too slow. I mean, just to be frank, it's just too slow. When it takes, for a given space system, a significant space system could take 10 or 15 years to field. So you think about that. Let's say you lock in the design at the 4-year point, and then you don't field until you get to the 10-year point. You're talking about space qualified hardware, which takes a while to do. And the design's locked at the 4-year point. By the time you launch at the 10-year point, which, by the way, I'm being a little generous there, because some take longer. But you're several, just talk about computing power. Let's talk about Moore's Law that says basically every 18 months you double the computing power. You're that many generations behind in your computing capability, which is everything when you're talking about pushing ones and zeros around, which most of our space systems are all about. So it's just too doggone slow, and because it's so slow, it's very expensive. You know, as I think about the industry side, since I consult now, I get to see that side of the house a little bit better than certainly more than I was aware of when I was on active duty. But as we're waiting and we're slowly developing these systems stretched out over a long period of time, you're just burning money. And as a proposal gets submitted, if it takes a year to evaluate that proposal, all those people that came together to put that proposal together, they're either carried on overhead for a full year, which is very expensive for the company and not good for the stockholders, or they're dispersed to other programs to actually have a paying customer pay for their services. So you end up with kind of the worst of all worlds. You're either forcing the contractor into a situation where they have to somehow come up with the money to keep the team together, or you send these people out maybe to never reassemble to really produce something that they had built a proposal for. So it is something that must be addressed. It's being addressed, frankly. We are starting to see programs being wedged into a special authority that I believe was part of the National Defense Authorization Act in 2016. And that gives a much more expedited authority, some special authorities. Now, whether or not you can shoehorn all these space programs into that special authority or not is still a question for me, but let's say we can. That'll mandate that we must be done from authority to proceed to fielded capability in 5 years. That will be a tremendous improvement over what we're doing today.
Sure.
So I'm all about whatever is needed, but that is kind of putting a Band-Aid on the scab. The real problem here is the acquisition system is just too doggone slow.
Understand. Sir, switching a little bit and thinking about international relationships and our international partners. In your opinion, how important are those international partners for space situational awareness, communications, and other space capabilities?
Yeah, they're vitally important. We're talking about coalition warfare in almost anything we do. The question really becomes, how much capability can a given ally provide, given international partner, and maybe it's not even a designated ally, but somebody that's willing to partner with us. They can bring capability that does a lot of things in terms of confidence building for building coalitions in the future. It makes an adversary think twice about attacking capability if it's a shared kind of asset. You know, we got satellites on orbit that several countries have come together to actually buy and become part of that the service from that particular constellation. But on the other hand, I would hate to see us ever be critically dependent on an ally or a partner for a vital capability. I mean, we don't do that in any other medium that I'm aware of anyway. I don't think we decide how many F-35s we're going to buy based on what everybody else is buying. Mm-hmm. You know, we buy enough F-35s to get the job done, and then if we can get coalition partners to go along with us, all the better. And if they've bought F-35s, even better. But we don't want to look at space in a different way and say, well, I had a boss one time that said, let's throw everybody into a hot, sweaty pile, and then let's just make it difficult for the adversary. Well, I don't think that's really true. I don't think that's where we want to be as a nation. If we have to go independent, I want to have the capability to go independent.
Sure.
And we saw that play out in previous Middle East conflicts, where we've had to ask permission to use certain bases to then be the lily pad, if you will, for attacks. And in some cases, our targets have been judged by that particular owner of that lily pad, and in some cases denied. Now, imagine that in space, where somebody said, no, we don't agree with your objective, so we're going to say you can't use that satellite for this particular operation. We don't want to be in that position. We want to be in the position to have freedom of action on our terms, on our timing, and not be critically dependent. Having everybody together, great, but let's be in the position to go independent if we have to.
Focus on us first.
Absolutely.
And fill our requirements, and then if we can partner up, all the better.
Yeah.
All right, sir. So I have one final question for you. It has to do with, there's been a lot of controversy in the news recently about whether or not to have a separate Space Force or a separate service or corps. What are your thoughts on where the Space Forces or the space capabilities should remain? Should they remain under the Air Force, or is there a different way that we should present those forces?
Yeah. I had the privilege of, when I was commander of 14th Air Force, I wore a joint hat as well. I was the Joint Functional Component Commander for Space under U.S. Strategic Command. So I had to really understand what my authorities were, of course, and any joint commander does, and very clearly laid out in the Unified Command Plan, which is signed by the President, was a line of authority that goes from U.S. Strategic Command, and I'm talking about Space Forces now, U.S. Strategic Command to me as the Functional Component Commander for Space, and there was no doubt, there was no problem at all with authorities. I either had, well, in fact, let's just talk about tactical control. Every DoD space asset I had tactical control of, and no question, no problems at all with authority. So all this talk that you hear about, gee, we need a Space Force because we're not organized right, or we need a Space Corps because we're not acquiring right, or all those kinds of things, it's really, it's a bit of a red herring for me. I don't believe, if you talk to the commander of U.S. Strategic Command today, I don't believe he would tell you he has any concerns at all about lines of authority. You know, there are some Navy space assets, there are some Army space assets, the lion's share of it's in the Air Force, but all the services know exactly who they report to in an operational sense. Acquisition, we've already talked about that. There is definitely a problem with acquisition. Let's go solve the acquisition problem. Let's not worry about the organizational issues that really aren't organizational issues anyway. Now, if you're just trying to get the attention of the Air Force with some of the legislation that's been passed and some of the legislation that's currently being proposed, okay, I understand that. My concern is, though, is that as this particular bill, the FY19 National Defense Authorization Act, works its way through the House and the Senate, that there will be some compromise that really kind of ties our hands and takes us down a path that perhaps we don't want to go down. There are studies underway right now on what the best organizational construct would be, but I really don't understand the rush to judgment for an organizational issue that in my mind does not exist, because the President has already signed a unified command plan that clearly articulates who's in charge.
General Shelton, thank you for your time today. We truly appreciate and value your perspective on emerging space topics. Thank you for joining us, and we wish you the best in your endeavors and your advocacy for space through the National Space Foundation. Thank you.
Thanks.